right, so my latest book, American Scare, Florida's Hidden Cold War on Black and Queer Lives, is an expose about a largely forgotten purge, inquisition, in Red Scare, McCarthy-era Florida, that for 9 years, from 1956 to 1965, held residents of the so-called Sunshine State ransom to an extrajudicial legislative committee with the power to declare Black integrationists or closeted queer educators or charismatic state employees or anyone it didn't like with the same stroke. What did it call them? Communists, perverts, Marxists, enemies of the people. I wish those words, those accusations, and these histories, right, of violations, really, of life and liberties on American soil didn't sound so familiar right now. American Scare tells the recovered history, it's a recovered history, of the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, a roving white investigation group out of Tallahassee that somehow always found someone new and vulnerable to investigate. Charlie Johns' 9-year-long crusade against Blacks and queer folk was so notorious that people nicknamed the committee after him, and they called it the Johns Committee. And there are only a few survivors left, actually, of the Johns Committee's terrible, terrible campaign. But whenever any of them says the Johns Committee, you can feel the chill from their words come into your bones. The past 6 years of my life have been spent decensoring redacted state of Florida documents so that I could put together who the Johns Committee hurt, what happened to them, and what happened to them later after they'd lost their reputations. This is something I actually haven't done before, where I'm going to talk to you about a person destroyed by the Johns Committee, who was actually one of the most important people that the Johns Committee ever faced. This is the department head of the University of Florida Geography Department. His name was Dr. Sigismund Dietrich, and Dr. Dietrich was perhaps the greatest scholar ever on Florida, who studied about Florida, actually, and he was destroyed by the Florida Johns Committee. So this was a guy that loved the state pretty much more than anyone else and studied the new Florida state when it was booming. He was one of the first to spot it as something special. University of Florida Department Chairman Sig Dietrich received his call from the committee on a Monday evening, January 1959. That afternoon, the renowned authority on Florida geography administered a final exam to his afternoon class and then returned home to 1418 Northwest 17 Terrace. This is all in Gainesville. Drained from a long semester, Dietrich found a plush chair and fell into a dreamless slumber. His schedule hardly let up year-round. His wife, Irene, who taught piano lessons from their home, had constant health expenses stemming from a malarial condition aggravated by the Florida climate. Then there were the never-ending rounds of grading, due for students this semester by January 29th. After daily and nightly extracurriculars, Dietrich answered correspondence and crafted draft proposals at his home office until well after 2 or 3 in the morning. Every Sunday, Dietrich rejuvenated body and spirit as choir director for St. Patrick Catholic Church, where Irene played organ. As a Hungarian Catholic immigrant, Dietrich had become a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1938 and reveled in the mighty fine feeling of being a legitimate Floridian. Compared to the hovels of his upbringing, he now lived in a palatial North Florida estate. For Dietrich, this single-family home represented the promise of an American century made manifest. Around 6 p.m., the Florida sun had already set, and the house sat in an eerie darkness. Cutting through that stillness, the telephone rang. Roused from his nap, Dietrich supposed it might be a colleague or a student panicked about final exams. Mentees in the graduate program did feel comfortable calling him at home, and they lovingly nicknamed him Dr. D, actually. He picked up the receiver, holding it to his ear. He must have looked cherubically tousled. He had a kind round face that many strangers took to be unformidable at first glance. He stood a mere 5'8", with dark brown hair that ordinarily slicked back fell into his face when he hustled, slightly round about the waist. He was wont to tuck his button-down shirts into his khaki pants and cinch everything with a high-waisted belt. "Hello, this is Sig," Dietrich spoke into the receiver clearly and deliberately, his speech lightly accented. Dietrich, as with many of his generation, treated someone on the other end of a telephone line with a form of reverence. It was somebody or other most politely inviting me to appear before Charlie Johns's committee right away, Dietrich recalled. I went. The drive from his house to the out-of-the-way Manor Motel, 2 miles north of town on US 441, took less than 15 minutes. Red Scare agents of the McCarthy-era Florida Johns Committee, a legislative inquest led by state senators determined to find scapegoats, made Dietrich sweat out an hour in an anteroom of the motel. How is this happening? An internationally celebrated man of letters, in 1953, Dietrich had been president of the Florida Academy of Sciences. He'd authored more than 30 books, and deep within his geographer's brain, an eternal flame burned for his adopted home of Florida. Dietrich waited in the whites-only Mannered Motel. He must have looked more like a fusty academic than a patriot. No one from the Johns Committee knew they were staring at a war hero, much less the preeminent scholar of the state they claimed to be protecting. Vital subjects and projects still hung in the balance for this assiduous man. The U.S. State Department had recently awarded him a 1-year Fulbright fellowship to teach and research. What would happen to that award now? Agents called him into the room. Then, Dietrich remembered, my ordeal began. In front of him sat the chief lawyer for the Johns Committee, Mark Hawes, chief investigator for the Johns Committee, Remus Strickland, and UF campus spy for the Johns Committee, Officer John Tileston, plus a Florida state senator by the name of William O'Neill, whose presence satisfied Florida rules for quorum. This would be an official state hearing. Hawes began by scaring the professor about potential attendant publicity from news reporters if the delicate subject of their conversation was not handled, quote, as discreetly and quietly as possible. They compelled Dietrich to swear an oath to all questions propounded. From the outset, Chief Lawyer Hawes wielded the damningly vivid testimony of gay collegial informants, other UF professors who'd copped to homosexual activities to save their careers, against Sig Dietrich to great effectiveness, with reams of material from the informant network. Johns Committee lawyer Mark Hawes barely needed a confession to doom this foreign-born man. Quote, they were nice, polite, even sympathetic, Dietrich recalled of his subjugators, but anyone reading the record would have had the most horrible picture of me. I was trapped. As a boon to the committee, Dietrich, the penitent Catholic, quickly fell back on the sacrament of penance or confession. In what could best be described as a psychological hitch, Dietrich confessed on the belief that a sorrowful admission of his sin would precede the forgiveness of a pastoral authority. Mr. Dietrich, have you participated in any homosexual activity since you've been a member of the faculty out here? Well, no, I wouldn't say that. Now, Mr. Dietrich, oh, you would know whether you have or not, have you? Well, how would you define it? You know what sex is, don't you? Yes. Have you had any sexual activity with another man? Well, mutual masturbation, yes. 10 minutes into interrogation, Dietrich sowed the seeds of his own destruction. Taken aback at the speed of the man's confession, Mark Hawes backpedaled with a sympathetic sidebar. Dietrich was so compliant and remorseful that Mark Hawes could barely get out a sentence without the witness cutting in to register his self-disgust. When the committee excused him, Dietrich asked his tormentors, "What shall I do now?" Someone told him, "Act normal as ever." The geographer wandered back to his car and drove home, feeling the scarlet letter branded upon his very being. Something terrible was bound to happen, he was sure. Blurry days bled into each other. Sigismund Dietrich never knew when the hammer blow would strike. He shuddered each time the phone rang.